Imagine this. You wake up in a hospital bed, surrounded by the cold beeping of machines monitoring your body. The sterile smell of disinfectant hangs in the air. You're scared, but you trust the doctors in white coats. After all, they're here to save your life. But what if that trust was misplaced? What if, instead of curing you, they were turning you into the subject of a twisted secret experiment? You've just been injected with live cancer cells. And the worst part, you had no idea. This isn't a nightmare. This is real. This happened. The doctor who injected cancer, Chester Southam. This is not just a dark chapter in medical history, it's a warning. A warning about what happens when ambition, power, and science blur the lines of morality. We enter the story of Chester Southam, a man hailed as a pioneer in cancer research. Southam believed he could demonstrate that the human body had an immune response to cancer. But instead of using test tubes or animal models, he chose a more controversial path, injecting live cancer cells directly into human beings. To understand this, we need to go back to the beginning. Chester Southam was born in 1919 in the heart of New York City. The son of a nurse, he grew up fascinated by the mysteries of the human body. His curiosity led him to the University of New York, where he graduated with honors in 1934. But his true calling was oncology, the study of cancer. He was determined to conquer the disease, but that determination soon turned into something far darker. In the 1950s, when the world was celebrating medical advancements, a darker truth lay beneath the surface. The prosperity and discoveries of the era masked a sinister side that often went unnoticed. The Tuskegee syphilis study, where African American men were left untreated for decades, is just the tip of the iceberg. Today, we delve into an even more insidious chapter in the history of American medicine, one that targeted prisoners, the mentally ill, and vulnerable patients who had no idea they were being used as guinea pigs. The 1950s and 60s were decades of medical progress, or so we were led to believe. But beneath the gleaming surfaces of prestigious institutions, dark experiments were unfolding. Experiments where doctors crossed ethical lines, injecting living cancer cells into human subjects and observing the outcomes. During World War II, Southam served as a military doctor, witnessing the horrors of war up close. The brutality of the battlefield had a profound impact on him. He saw life torn apart in an instant, and death became a daily companion. When the war ended, Southam returned with a mission to fight a different kind of battle. His new enemy? Cancer, a silent killer that devastated lives just as ruthlessly as the war. At that time, cancer research was still in its infancy. Doctors and scientists were beginning to understand the nature of cancer, but much remained unknown. Treatments were rudimentary and often dangerous. The disease was seen as an almost inevitable death sentence. And yet, Chester Southam saw an opportunity, a chance to change that. But instead of following a path guided by ethical principles, he veered into territory that would later be deemed unforgivable. Southam believed he could prove that the human body had an immune response to cancer. He hypothesized that if he injected cancer cells into human subjects, he could observe how the body reacted, potentially unlocking the key to understanding and curing the disease. But instead of conducting his experiments in a controlled environment, using test tubes or animal models, Southam chose a more controversial path. He injected live cancer cells directly into human beings. His subjects were unaware of the true nature of the experiments they were part of. They trusted him, and that trust was betrayed. His victims were elderly patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, people suffering from non-cancerous conditions, unaware that malignant cells were being secretly introduced into their bodies. These patients were not informed that they were part of a cancer experiment. Southam described the injections as harmless tests, downplaying the gravity of what was happening. One patient, speaking years later, said, "I trusted them. I thought they were helping me, but all the while they were using me. My body wasn't mine anymore. I was just another experiment to them." Southam believed that by introducing cancer cells into these patients, he could observe the immune response in a real-world context. However, this rationale was deeply flawed. His patients, often too ill to advocate for themselves, were not given the opportunity to refuse participation. This blatant disregard for consent was emblematic of a larger issue within the medical community, where the ends often justified the means. Southam's unethical practices didn't stop with hospital patients. He needed healthy subjects, so he turned to prisoners. The Ohio State Penitentiary became a hunting ground for his twisted experiments. Over 600 prisoners were injected with live cancer cells, many of them unaware of the true risks. "We didn't know," one prisoner recalls. "They never told us what they were doing. They said it was just some tests, something to help people. But they didn't tell us they were putting cancer in our bodies." Chester Southam's motivations were steeped in a complex mixture of scientific ambition and a troubling disregard for ethics. He was deeply influenced by the medical ethos of his time, which often prioritized research outcomes over patient rights. In his mind, these injections could provide crucial insights into how cancer spread and how the immune system responded, but at what cost? The story of Henrietta Lacks also emerges from this dark panorama. A poor African-American woman who, in 1951, unknowingly became part of one of the most important medical advances of the century. Her cells, known as HeLa cells, were the first immortal human cells grown in a laboratory, capable of dividing indefinitely, unlike normal cells. These cells would be used for decades in experiments around the world, including Southam's. Southam believed these immortal cells could hold the secret to curing cancer, revolutionizing medical research by contributing to vaccines, cancer treatments, and even genetic mapping. But Henrietta Lacks never knew. Her family never knew. And while science benefited, the Lacks family received nothing. Henrietta Lacks cells still live today, a testament to what science can achieve. But her story, and those of countless others like her, remind us that behind the advances we celebrate are human beings whose lives were changed, and in some cases destroyed, by unethical experimentation. As Southam's experiments continued, the lines between scientific progress and ethical violations blurred even further. He believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough. His findings showed that some patients' immune systems rejected the cancer cells, sparking hope that the body might hold a natural defense against the disease. But for others, the cancer spread, sometimes fatally. Southam was willing to sacrifice everything, lives, trust, even morality, in his quest to conquer cancer. But his time was running out. In the early 1960s, Southam's experiments came under scrutiny. 3 Jewish doctors, who understood the dark echoes of medical experimentation from the horrors of the Holocaust, refused to stay silent. They exposed Southam's practices to the public, sparking outrage and a trial that would change the course of medical ethics forever. They could no longer turn a blind eye to the unethical practices that were unfolding. When news of the experiments broke in 1964, public outrage erupted. The scandal highlighted the urgent need for ethical standards in medical research, as it became apparent that patients' rights were frequently compromised in the name of scientific advancement. "We trusted him," one former patient testified. "We thought he was there to help us, but instead he used us. He took away our choice, our humanity. We weren't patients to him. We were just subjects." During the trial, Southam's defense was chilling. He argued that his experiments were for the greater good, that the potential to cure cancer justified the methods. But the testimonies of his victims told a different story. Patients described their betrayal, the pain of knowing they had been used as tools for a doctor's ambition. They were not just numbers or statistics, they were human beings whose rights had been violated in the name of progress. In the end, Southam was found guilty of medical misconduct, but his punishment? A mere 1-year suspension of his medical license. Astonishingly, just 2 years later, he was appointed president of the American Cancer Society. How could a man who had crossed every ethical line be honored with such a title? The answer lies in the uncomfortable reality of the medical community at the time. Despite the Nuremberg Code, established after the horrors of Nazi medical experiments during World War II, informed consent was still not universally practiced or enforced. Doctors wielded immense power over their patients, and the boundaries between scientific research and human rights were often blurred. Southam, despite his transgressions, was seen by some as a brilliant scientist whose work could potentially lead to life-saving breakthroughs. But even as medical ethics evolved, the scars left by Southam's experiments remained. For the patients and prisoners who had trusted the doctors and institutions meant to protect them, the damage was irreparable. Their bodies had been violated, their autonomy stripped away, all in the name of a scientific crusade. In interviews years after his trial, he continued to defend his work, insisting that the knowledge gained was worth the risks. He believed that the end, the potential cure for cancer, justified the means. But his victims, the patients and prisoners he injected with live cancer cells without their full knowledge or consent, tell a different story. One of the most striking aspects of Southam's story is how openly he conducted his experiments. Unlike the secretive nature of some unethical medical studies, Southam's work was published in medical journals and presented at conferences. The medical community was aware of what he was doing, and yet few questioned it at the time. It wasn't until those 3 Jewish doctors at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital blew the whistle that the ethical implications were brought to light. The trial, however, was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a larger conversation about bioethics in the 20th century. Southam's actions, along with other unethical studies such as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, forced the medical community and the public to reckon with the dark side of scientific research. The case of Chester Southam became a turning point in the history of medical ethics. It was a catalyst for change. In the wake of these scandals, the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964 and later the Belmont Report in 1978 would establish stricter guidelines for human experimentation, including the now fundamental principle of informed consent. No longer could doctors perform experiments on unwitting patients. The right to know what is happening to your own body became a cornerstone of modern medical ethics. But beyond these reforms, the legacy of Chester Southam serves as a stark reminder of the responsibility that comes with scientific power. His story is a lesson about the dangers of unchecked ambition, of what can happen when the lines between discovery and exploitation blur. His work, no matter the results, will always be tainted by the human cost of his unethical choices. Even today, as we push the boundaries of science in fields like genetics, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence, Southam's story is a cautionary tale. It reminds us that no matter how noble the goals, scientists and doctors must never lose sight of the ethical principles that protect the dignity and rights of individuals. The pursuit of knowledge, while essential, must always be tempered by compassion and respect for humanity. Chester Southam will forever be remembered as a man who crossed the line. For some, he was a brilliant mind chasing the cure for one of humanity's most terrifying diseases. But for many others, he was a villain, a man who sacrificed human lives in the name of progress. His story is complex, but the lesson is clear. The advancement of science should never come at the cost of human dignity. Today, in classrooms and medical schools around the world, Southam's case is studied as a warning, an example of what can happen when the pursuit of knowledge goes too far. His experiments may be long over, but the ethical questions they raise remain as relevant as ever. As we continue to explore the frontiers of medicine and science, we must always remember, there is no progress without ethics. The legacy of Chester Southam is a chilling reminder of the consequences of losing sight of our humanity. And it's a legacy that we must never allow to repeat itself. As you ponder these questions, consider this. How far would you go in the name of science? Would you trust those in white coats, or would you hesitate, knowing the shadows of history? The echoes of Southam's experiments remind us that the line between healer and harmer can blur disturbingly fast. What secrets lie beneath the facade of medical innovation? Reflect on these thoughts as you move forward. In a world where the quest for knowledge sometimes eclipses compassion, what does it mean to truly heal?